Okay. And for our opening prayer today, I have turned to Padre Gotuma from the Corrymeela community in Ireland, um, which, as you may know, is dedicated to prayer and activism for peace and justice. And just feels like the right tone to set this morning. So let us pray. Courage comes from the heart, and we are always welcomed by God, the heart of all being. We bear witness to our faith, knowing that we are called to live lives of courage, love, and reconciliation in the ordinary and extraordinary moments of each day. We bear witness too to our failures and our complicity in the fractures of our world. May we be courageous today. May we learn today. May we love today. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So I thought I would start by, well, before I ask the question, where is Jesus? Did anyone have anything left over from last week they wanted us to revisit? So last week we got through chapter 7, verse 30. And you may remember that last passage in that part of the chapter was all about the Syrophoenician woman who approaches Jesus because her daughter is ill and needs healing. And there's that wonderful exchange when Jesus says, it's not right that the children's crumbs be given to the dogs and all of that. And then she retorts with, well, even the dogs get to eat the crumbs under the table. And he says, basically, for that, go to the head of the class. Your daughter is well. When you get home, you will find her healed. Did anyone have anything left over from that they wanted to revisit? Okay, hearing nothing. I always like to locate Jesus for us. So that exchange with the Syrophoenician woman took place up here in Tyre. And then we're in the next section that we're about to read. Jesus makes his way back down to the Decapolis. So he's all over this area. And the Decapolis, of course, is primarily Gentile territory, not 100%, but primarily. And so we will see what Jesus is up to there in a moment. Um, but last week he was up here in Tyre and Sidon, which is modern day Lebanon mostly.
And that information helped us answer a Jeopardy question correctly.
Well, yay!
You know,
Did my buddy Matt get that question?
probably he gets most.
Exactly.
You have to take joy where you can get it.
Amen to that, my sister. Oh boy. All right. So the demon has left the Syrophoenician woman's daughter, and now Jesus is on the road again. Would someone like to finish up this last paragraph from chapter 7 before we push into chapter 8?
Sure.
Thank you.
Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon down towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and spat and touched his tongue. Then, looking to heaven, he said to him, Epitha, that is, be opened. And immediately his ears were opened and his tongue released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak.
Thanks, Fred. Before we talk about the story itself, I just want to go back to the map for a second because, you know, Mark says that Jesus, come on, load. Jesus goes from Tyre by way of Sidon down to the Decapolis. So
I
not
was wondering about that.
yeah, not a particularly direct route, if you ask me, when you're on foot. But there he goes up there, and then presumably makes his way down. Mark doesn't give us the exact route, but eventually he gets down here. This brown area is the Decapolis. So, that's why it's so important, at least for me, to look at the map, because without it, I could just say, oh, yeah, of course he went via Poseidon. Well, not so much, and of course. So, for whatever that's worth, I share that with you.
It looks like there's some fairly steep mountains if you just go straight east. So
Mhm.
maybe Sidon was the slower way, or he had something to do.
Might have had something to do. Might still be trying to get some quiet time, which doesn't seem to be easy for him to
Oh, is it a
find.
more populated route than going straight across the mountains?
Could be. Very much
More,
could be.
Jesus is traveling light, as it were,
Mm-hmm.
and he needs
Needs places
towns
to
that will
stay, right?
and feed him.
Yep, exactly. And if you remember his charge to the apostles earlier, he said, when someone goes into a town and they welcome you, stay there, and let them feed you, let them take care of you. So that's a great point. Ellie, were you going to say something?
Oh, I was just agreeing.
Well, what do you hear or notice in this story?
Well, I noticed that there are several steps to this miracle about the putting the fingers in the ears and spitting and so forth. And the one immediately preceding, when he cast out the demon, he did so remotely.
Yeah, kind of by Zoom, right? He wasn't even there. Yeah, good point. Excellent.
Yeah, that struck me too. This is another one of the heavy duty, hard work miracles, like the blind man with the clay and such. All I can think is that the person was a lot worse. I mean, the reason for his deafness was probably congenital, that he just didn't have the right organs, so it just took more effort to correct them. Or there could be no, there's no disbelief around him. He got support from that. So I think it was just one of those really major things that he had to work at.
Mm-hmm.
And this
There
is
is
another one where
no.
he's sorry.
No, go ahead.
Sorry, I'll stop now. This is another one where he's saying, "Don't tell anybody," and then they go out and do.
Yeah, definitely. What were you going to say, Fred?
No, I said there isn't anything that said he'd been deaf since birth, and but normally if you can't hear, you will have speech impediment because you can't get any feedback from what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So if he had been deaf, since childhood or whatever, he might well have a speech impediment.
Definitely. And we can imagine how that keeps him sort of on the margins of community, right? Because he can't communicate. And remember as well, and Mark doesn't say this, but if we think about the story of the healing of the blind man in John's gospel, remember what people said when they brought the young man to Jesus for healing? Remember the question?
Who sinned?
Exactly. Did he sin or did his parents sin? Why is he blind? Somebody had to have done something wrong for him to be blind. So, even though it's not named explicitly here, we know that culturally that's sort of an assumption as well. So he's probably on the margins, on the outskirts of the community. But somebody cared enough about him to bring him to Jesus. And again, it's interesting that the Decapolis is not an entirely Jewish area. So we don't know if this man is Jewish or Gentile, I don't think. So there are lots of things we just don't know. It's a short excerpt, short vignette.
although it is interesting because I've been looking at the gospel parallels,
Right.
and Matthew has been tracking Mark all the way down, sometimes embellishing Mark and adding more. This one, he just edits out. He just says the people, they brought the lame and the deaf and he healed them, period.
Period.
And
Interesting.
then goes right on. So
He had no use or no reason to tell the story, apparently. That's so helpful that you are tracking the gospel parallel, so thank you. Because it's just interesting to see, because we're pretty sure that Matthew and Luke came after Mark and they rely heavily on Mark. And so to see what the other gospels do with the core story that Mark presents I think is really helpful. And to Ellie's point, this healing takes more work and it's messy, right? He Jesus sticks his fingers in this guy's ears and he spits and touches his tongue. I mean, if we think about Jesus as God incarnate, this is Jesus right up in this guy's face, quite literally. And it's not neat and tidy. It's not remote like the young woman, the daughter of the Syrophoenician woman.
I'm thinking about the fact that you weren't allowed to come into the presence of God with any sort of vestiges of mortality. You had to be purified. I'm sure you weren't allowed to spit or
Probably not.
Any of those other things in the sanctuary. And yet Jesus is. I don't know if there's anything there, but
it's an earthy healing, right? And it's just what always strikes me, and to that point, Fred, is that Jesus is not at all afraid to touch the leper, to spit on and touch this man's tongue, to stick his fingers in his ears, to make paste and touch a blind man's eye. It's not the remote Michelangelo's God in the Sistine Chapel reaching out for Adam. This is down and dirty in the human experience. And that just always is touching to me. Does anybody wonder about that sigh in verse 34? Looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, be opened. What's that sigh about, do you suppose?
He's buckling down to a real big job. All right.
Let's see what the Greek says. Let's see. Sorry. Okay. Deep sigh. Let's see what. Okay, come on. A groan. A sigh or a groan. And so I wonder what that is.
Well, Tyre was a pretty big place, wasn't it? An important.
He's not in Tyre anymore.
Oh.
He's moved. He's traveled up and around.
Yeah, but I mean, this is the worst person they can find who needs healing. There aren't any cancers or festering sores or lepers or.
So you're thinking, Fred, that maybe Jesus is saying, "Okay, I'll do this." Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Well, I'm just sort of wondering, that if you're going to prioritize, this would not be the first person in a, in sort of a reasonably populated area that is most in need of help. Triage seems to have failed here.
Well, although Jesus took him aside in private, so I mean, this wasn't on the stage doing a healing revival. He was taking him aside and healing him. So I don't know if there's a implication that he was looking for marketing, particularly where he said, "Don't tell anybody about this." So
I wonder.
Well, he ordered the crowd not to tell anybody. By that time, it was kind of too late.
Well, see, he comes back speaking clearly. I wonder if he was trying to keep it more private because of the effort that it took him to do this miracle, and he didn't really necessarily want everybody to think that miracles were difficult for him. I don't know.
Hmm.
But I think that we've been watching a lot of baseball, and when a pitcher throws a really hard pitch, he grunts, and that sounds like this is effort.
That's funny you say that because we were, of course, watching the Yankees Red Sox game last night, and there's no joy in our house right now. My children are Yankees fans from all our years in New York, but Andrew kept saying, "Man, I can really hear him grunting tonight." I guess the microphone was turned up particularly loudly, and it was such a visceral ooh every time. So when you say that, that's a great connection. What's that sigh, that groan? Is it a groan of lament? Is it irritation that, oh, I have to do this? Is it, this is hard work? Hard to know.
If I have sort of another take on it,
Great.
that he kept telling everybody, don't tell anyone, because I think that he knew he would be inundated with requests for healing, and he could do the healing, but I think that he really would rather have done the preaching
Mm-hmm.
and the teaching, and he didn't want to become like a traveling sideshow.
Ah, that's great, Donna. Because as we know, and Fred has talked about this before, that at this time in the first century, there were all these guys, mostly guys, wandering around, these wonder workers, kind of doing the traveling sideshow shtick. I can't say that, sideshow shtick. And so Jesus is, clearly different from that. So that's a great point.
I sort of see it, him looking up to heaven, to his Father, separating himself from what he's doing here, and then now calling back to do the work. I mean, that's sort of just the way I read it. It just was, he's looking up to heaven, the connection is there, then sigh, I've got to go back and do my work here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's just the way it struck me.
That's terrific. What strikes me looking at the Greek and that deep sigh, that groan, that to me, that just sort of underscores the physicality and the earthiness of all of it, along with the spitting and the sticking the fingers in the ear. It's a reminder to me, and I don't know that this is Mark's intention, but this is what I take from it, of Jesus is in a body. He is an embodied God. And so that deep groan, you can just imagine it coming out of the solar plexus. It all, to me, it fits so well with the earthiness of this scene. N.T. Wright, who, as you know, I follow, says this about this moment. He says, healing then, and perhaps healing now, though we don't always realize it, can never be simply a matter of correcting a few faults in the machine called the human body. It always was and is, and perhaps supremely so in Jesus' actions, a sign of God's love breaking into the painful and death-laden present world. And he makes the point, because one could argue, well, why does this man, and this is kind of what Fred was saying, why does this man get healed when there are probably a lot of other people waiting in line and maybe in more dire straits? So what is it about him? And so N.T. Wright says, well, this is a manifestation of the inbreaking of the kingdom of God. This isn't the reason for Jesus coming. He didn't just come, and this is what Donna was saying, to go around and go zap, 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 you're healed. This was about demonstrating the power of God. Excuse me. Anything else there? I got to ask, why does Jesus order them to tell no one? If he's coming to preach the kingdom of God, what's that about?
I forget which author, I read that made the suggestion that, Jesus was still not overly famous. Mark talks about the fact that, but he didn't have, a phenomenal following.
It's more localized, right?
Yeah. And that the author of the gospel was trying to explain why he wasn't known, throughout
Hmm.
the region.
Hmm.
He hasn't done that. Told, I forget the sequence of the miracles, but the other one was was a leper, and I can't remember if that happened before this or not. But he hasn't done that very often.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So why now and why the other time?
Yeah, great question. Does it have something to do with the location in the Decapolis? I don't know.
Where was the
And,
other one?
hmm.
Where was the? I'm just
The
remembering one
leper,
other.
I can't remember.
One,
I don't-
134, 144, 145,
And where was that?
724. I don't know. Those are the notes.
Ah, okay. Boy, you're good, John.
Oh right, yeah, back in verse in chapter 1.
Let's see where. Let's see. Yep, a leper came to him. Let's see. I think there's at that point
140.
they're in the Galilee, so they're in more Jewish territory. So I don't know.
Could that be, given that, is that a possibility that he wanted to keep focus on the Jewish population even in this, and not have a flood of Gentiles to deal with, that his message, as he saw it at the time, was for that community?
Possible, certainly if we think about the conversation last week with the Syrophoenician woman, let the
Yeah.
children, and by that he means the children of Israel, be fed first. That certainly could be a possibility. And he's in more Gentile territory now. Although I would say, why is he there? He's got to know, right? Don't get too grumpy, Jesus. You've come here, and so don't be surprised if people come to you asking to be healed. But maybe that is the point that, yeah, he'll do it, but he can't take his eyes off the prize of preaching and redeeming the children of Israel, preaching to and redeeming
Yeah.
the children of Israel. We'll hold that thought as we move into chapter 8 in a second.
It's so counterintuitive that people aren't going to tell others about this, that maybe it's reverse psychology.
Yeah.
Maybe he actually wants them to go tell a lot of people. I don't know. It's so unlikely that they're not going to tell people.
Absolutely. Don't think about a pink elephant, Jackie. Don't think about it. Right
Exactly.
Hello. Of course, we all have a pink elephant in our head. So there is something to that. Yeah,
I don't know.
Expect. But I've always thought the same thing, that when we like to kid at Randy's former parish in New York, he had a parishioner, wonderful woman, one of the church ladies who showed up for everything, was always there doing altar guild and coffee hour and did the whole bit. And he knew very well that if he wanted information to get out but didn't want to have to publish it in the newsletter or whatever, he would just pull her aside and say, now let's not tell a lot of people, but, and then the next thing you knew, the whole parish knew. And it was a great strategy that Randy did over and over and over again. If you wanted people to know but didn't want to make a public announcement, just tell this one person and they would know by sundown. And inevitably, and that's human nature, right? If you tell me don't tell anybody, it's going to be hard not to tell anybody. So that's, I do think that there's some psychology involved in that.
I don't think of him as manipulative,
Right.
in that way.
Yep.
But still, it was so unlikely that they weren't going to tell people.
Yep.
you know, that's
Well,
Especially one
particularly
that's
when he takes him back to the crowd.
Exactly. And this guy
Yeah.
has not been able to speak or hear, and suddenly he is able. His tongue was released, and that language, and N.T. Wright makes the point. It's a very evocative description because in the Greek, I guess it's really about his tongue had been all tied up in knots, and then suddenly it wasn't anymore. So there's something about this plain speech, this ability to communicate, which involves restoration into relationship with other people, right? Because there wasn't sign language, probably, or certainly not closed captioning. There weren't ways to bring folks into the fold who struggled with it. And then he's restored. So yeah, of course, they're going to start talking.
But he could have sent him out the back door. He's
Mm-hmm.
pulled him away from the crowd.
Yep. But then he brings
He
him
could
back
have, as he
in.
told the other leper, go straight to the temple.
Mm-hmm.
Don't worry about those people in the crowd.
Mm-hmm. Go tell the priest
Word
what
would have
happened.
gotten out anyway, but it would have been slower.
Right. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting here at verse 36, and this could just be a translation thing. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one. So here the man has been pulled aside, to your point. But at some point, and Mark doesn't make this explicit, but at some point everyone saw what happened because he had to have come back in to the rest of the crowd. And then, the messianic secret, don't tell.
Yep, that's at least they that brought the deaf man to him in the beginning and asked for
Mm-hmm.
help.
Yep, and we don't know how many they are, but it's more than one or two, probably. More than
Well,
one, for
Jesus
sure.
may have been perceived as divine, but that obviously didn't cut any ice with the town gossips.
Human nature being what it is. All right. Anything else before we push on? Okay, let's look at chapter 8. Would somebody like to read verses 1 through 10 for us? Please.
Okay.
Thank you, Ellie.
In those days, when there was again a great crowd without anything to eat, he called his disciples and said to them, I have compassion for the crowd, because they've been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from a great distance. His disciples replied, clueless, how can one feed these people with bread here in the desert? He asked them, how many loaves do you have? They said, 7. Then he ordered the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, and after giving thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute, and they distributed them to the crowd. They had also a few small fish, and after blessing them, he ordered that these too should be distributed. They ate and were filled, and they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. Now there were about 4,000 people. And he sent them away, and immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha.
And I'll just locate us on the map again before we talk about the. So he's been down here somewhere in the Decapolis, and Dalmanutha is up here. It's Magdala or in Megiddo. So he's back on the Sea of Galilee, back, in the area closer to Capernaum. So that's where he goes at the end of that story. But the miracle takes place over here on the eastern shore somewhere. All right. So, anyone having deja vu?
Yep.
So, of course, this reminds me of those puzzles that, we give to little kids. Look at the two pictures. What's different in these two? Here we go again with a feeding miracle. We just had one last week. Do you notice any differences between the two? And would it help to look at last week's text again?
Looks
I
to me
think
that it's
so.
just a little less efficient. He's got 7 loaves instead of 5, and he's only feeding 4,000 people with it. But
And
maybe they
only
didn't have enough
only
fish.
7 baskets of trash rather than 12.
But why would there be these differences? And how often did he do this anyway?
Yeah, good question. And what
Twice.
is, what is wrong with the disciples? How can one feed these people? Hello, where have you been? What might Mark be doing here?
Well, he seems to me to be, among other things, I mean, from the most secular point of view, he seems to be on a feeding ministry. He is bringing people together to eat, and people who are then already without food for whatever reason. We can attribute whatever significance we want to that and interpret it, but at least that they have in common.
And one of the details that is different here is when Jesus says, I have compassion for the crowd. He has compassion in the other story as well, because they've been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. So there's a real sense of urgency. These people are starving. They're really hungry. So much so that he's worried that they're going to collapse on the road on the way home.
I have wondered about that because what I've been told by people who know about these things is that basically the people at that time were pretty much day laborers. They didn't have much in the way of reserves. It's daily bread, and if they have not been working for 3 days, there's no way they could be eating.
That tells me also that this crowd is really devoted to following and listening to him. They're following him for 3 days. They've got no supplies with them, but still they stick with him.
I think what is of interest to me is that it's almost like a 3-day revival meeting. That, and I don't know if that was the content of it, but whatever it was, he had enough to say that he could, without repeating himself, because the same crowd, talk for 3 days. And I mean, he didn't have any praise band or choir or any, I mean, that's just really kind of remarkable. Like, what was he saying for 3 days?
That is a great question.
I
Yeah.
mean, that's what we really need to know more than the details of, I mean, that's what frustrates me. You have all these miracles and you get the details of the miracles, but you don't really need to know that. You really need to know what he was talking about for 3 days.
You want the transcript of that preaching.
Yeah.
I mean, that's,
Of
that
course,
is really
orators went on for much longer back then.
What did?
You know, the orators.
Orators.
You know, like the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln's address was widely panned at the time for being so short. The person who went before him went on for 4 hours.
kind of like a filibuster.
And well, you were entertaining the crowd, and they had come a long way, and they didn't want to spend half a day getting there and half a day getting home to listen to 20 minutes.
Yeah, is that all you got?
You know, back to your point of, you know, why did they put this in? You know, if you go down to the east of the Pharisees and Herod, he's putting a nail, another nail in this. Why are you so slow? Maybe this is one of your markets and sandwiches.
Excellent. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. Now, I don't know how much to read into this. N.T. Wright makes the point that in the other feeding miracle, which was in the Jewish portion of the Galilee, there were 12 baskets. You think of 12 tribes of Israel, 12 being the number. And then here it's 7. And N.T. Wright says that some people have speculated that 7 is a number associated with the Gentiles because there's 70 nations. Now, Amy Jill Levine says that 7 is the number of completeness, as we know about the days of the week. So, there are different ways to interpret that. But clearly, Mark intends something with the numerology there. And there are fewer people. There are only 4,000 as opposed to the 5,000 before.
According to Matthew, there were 4,000 men besides women and children. So we'll have to figure out our count again.
The census did not include the women and children.
What was the reproduction rate in the year 0?
Or child mortality, for that matter.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I don't know. I look at the 3 days and riffing on Fred's remarks. It seems to me he's teaching. I don't know if he's revving up the crowd as he does that, or whether he fascinates them because he is, I believe, turning their religion inside out for them in front of them. And they could be fascinated with that. He could be taking it in slow drips over a 3-day period. And maybe they had a praise band, who knows, shofars and drums or something. I mean, whatever it took.
Right.
But it was time for the message. That gives time for the message to sink in and be discussed among the people as he's applying it to them. Even getting the words out of his mouth to 4,000 people was like, remember when it was the Occupy movement, and the ones in the front rows would hear what was said by the speaker and turn around and broadcast it to the 30 people behind them, repeating it. Maybe something like that was going on. We just don't know. But it looks to me like I would not see him talking for 3 days. I would see something else happening in the way of teaching while that's going, to reinforce the teaching, install the teaching, whatever we want to call it, during that period. He has a radical approach. He's very radical.
Discussion groups.
Yeah.
But
I'm
also
with Donna.
speaking in parables. Took him a while to sort it out.
But I'm with Donna. I really would like to know some of what he's saying for 3 days.
Boy, I would too.
Definitely. I think your assumption, Ray, about him turning their religion inside out is pretty accurate. It's got to be, right? Because everything that he has said thus far, as he has preached the kingdom of God in Mark's gospel, Matthew has a different take, but Mark, it's all about, turning things upside down. Why do your disciples heal on the Sabbath? Well, why do you let them eat things that have been declared unclean? And so he's constantly problematizing the law for its own, the law qua law, the law for its own sake. So, it makes perfect sense to me that he's doing some of that.
And then editorially, the defenders of the faith come up in verse 11.
Exactly.
I mean, if we take out the demand for a sign there, which wasn't there in the text, here's the action reaction.
Yep. And, not surprising that they would say, wait a minute. The other thing you raise, Ray, which I think makes a lot of sense too, is, just the question about the reliability of the message as it spreads out among 4,000 people, because you're right, they're not all hearing it in real time as he is saying it. The message is going to have to be mediated from, one ring or row or cluster of people back. I mean, it has to be. Even even if he is in a natural amphitheater situation, and we know that was a lot of why he went in boats and got out a little ways into the sea to preach, because his voice would carry over the water. But even at that, and here he's in the desert, we know that it's not always the message isn't going to be transmitted so reliably if humans are the mouthpieces. So that's an interesting aspect to this as well.
And then the 3 days would give time for the misinterpretations to bubble up and be answered, discussed, sorted out.
Mm-hmm. Kind of like whack-a-mole. Put down one thing and then another thing
Yeah.
pops up.
Well, further explanation. I mean, if
Mm-hmm.
if you grab the knife by the wrong end, here's your chance. Let's.
Yeah, exactly.
I've often thought that is a problem with Christianity. Jesus died too early.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at Gautama or some of the other spiritual leaders who lived longer, they had a chance when people came up and said they got it wrong, to correct them.
Mm-hmm.
In Jesus' case, you can read, James and Paul disagreeing vehemently
Mm-hmm.
on, fundamental theological questions, and Jesus was never around, to answer them.
Well, and even before James, if you think about in Acts with Peter and Paul going at it in the Council of Jerusalem. Yeah. So, there's always that question of interpretation.
But that's a gift to us. The conflict is a gift.
Mm-hmm.
It's a dialectic that is going on and still goes on, and I'd argue that we're still learning from it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I agree. Anything else? What do you make about those disciples, though, in verse 4? And Ellie added her editorial remark, clueless, which is absolutely right. How can one feed these? Where were you? You were just here. You just went through this. What's wrong with you people?
Either that, or it's how come one feed people with bread here in the desert, Mr. Bones? So it could be setting him up. I don't know.
Or it could be that he's moving from place to place because there are already different groups of disciples,
Mm-hmm.
and the one just across the lake haven't experienced this miracle.
Mm-hmm. True. It's not. Mark doesn't necessarily say that it's the inner circle of the 12.
That's right.
Disciples could be, as we know, a very large number. So that's a very good point. But if he was going to groan like he did when he healed the deaf man, that would be the moment I would expect him to groan. It's like, oi! Yeah. Tearing his hair out. Like, okay.
Wait till the next verses.
What's that?
I said, wait till the next verse.
Exactly. We're getting there. But instead, he goes through it again. How many loaves do you have? And so, once again, he draws it out of them. And as I say, I don't know what
like
to
when
make
you're trying to get your kids to absorb the object lesson.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly how did you do this and what went wrong?
What could possibly go wrong? Well, anything else about that? Okay, so again, so as he goes up to the region of Dalmanutha, he's back, so crossing over the sea, and there he is back over here on the western shore. So we pick up here. Why don't we read these two paragraphs together? And that may be it for today. We'll see how it goes. Would someone like to do these two paragraphs for us?
Okay.
Thank you, Donna.
Right. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, asking him for a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation." And he left them, and getting into the boat again, he went across to the other side. The yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. Now the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, and they had only one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod." They said to one another, It is because we have no bread. And becoming aware of it, Jesus said to them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? And they said to him, 7. Then he said to them, do you not yet understand?
Thank you.
Wow.
Yep.
Wonder he's sighing deeply.
Yeah, let me look at that sigh because it may be a different word this time. Let's see. Hang on 1 second. Okay.
Right there, right there.
Doop. Let's see.
There.
Sighing deeply. Let's see. All right. This is the only time it gets used to draw up deep sighs from the bottom of the breast to sigh deeply. And it's interesting because anastanazo, that root there, the anastas part, has to do with resurrection. So, is it like breathing new life when he sighs? I don't know. But I'm fascinated by his sighs.
Definitely.
So he sighs deeply in his spirit. Well, poor Jesus. I mean, he's really surrounded by.
He tries so hard and they just don't get it.
They don't get it. They don't get. I love this. They forget to bring bread, and he says, "Beware the yeast." And they turn to one another. It's because we didn't bring any bread. It's just like, it's just such a ridiculous scene, I think.
What is the yeast of? I mean, is the yeast of Herod some metaphor?
Yeah.
What do you think it is?
Well, if the disciples are supposed to be leaven in the loaf, leaven has a power of changing spirit or being the spirit of something.
Beautiful.
So don't let the Pharisees and Herod infect your belief.
Yeah. I like that.
And it's so easy to get distracted by them.
Or discouraged.
Definitely.
Jesus is kind of testy right now because he's the no sign will be given to this generation, mic drop, and he's probably stewing over this, and then the disciples are being dense, and there's another, do you not understand? And then it doesn't go on from there.
Can I go back
silence
to
in both for a while? Sorry.
Can I go back to 12 and ask what generation means here? I'm thinking of it in terms of age group or something, but that I'm not sure if that's what they mean.
Let's see what the Greek says.
Genea.
That which has been begotten, men of the same stock, a family, the whole multitude of men, note the emphasis on men, living at the same time, an age.
Okay.
So I think yeah.
It's not a segment like the boomers or the Gen X's. I mean, it's
Why do these millennials act this way?
Okay, millennial.
I am no millennial.
But I think he
Patty,
may-
here's for you out of the gospel parallels, because both Luke and Matthew have a similar one, but they say they're not going to be given any sign except the sign of the prophet Jonah.
Ah,
ah,
So what is that sign? What does that mean?
well, if you think about the story of Jonah, Jonah is sent to Nineveh to preach, doesn't want to go. And then we know what happens. He gets swallowed by the big fish for 3 days, spat out, then goes and sits under a tree and is given shelter. Jonah's kind of slapped upside the head, like, come on. I gave you something to do it.
Does he do it at the end? Does Jonah
Yeah.
then speak to the
Yes.
people?
Yeah.
So maybe that's, the sign of Jonah is this preaching of the kingdom of heaven, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
or just the 3 days in darkness and then being resurrected from that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in 12, the generation, he could be simply referring to the group of Pharisees. I mean, the definition included
Mhm.
a group of a certain group rather than a whole era of everybody, of
It's
humanity.
interesting. I like that.
The whole thing, I mean, from 14 down doesn't seem to make any sense. To me, at least, there's too many non sequiturs. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, and Jesus warned them, "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod." I mean, he may be trying to remind them that they don't need bread or whatever,
Mhm.
but they discussed this with one another and said, "It is because we have no bread." I mean, that I don't see how you get from one to the other.
Well, I think the disciples are trying to figure that out too, and I think that's exactly why they're turning to each other. Like, why is he saying this? It must be because we didn't bring any bread. And I just wonder, after all of this, so we had the feeding of the 5,000, and then we had a little break with other things going on, other miracles, and then the feeding of the 4,000, and they get in the boat, and they don't bring bread. Is it that they figure we don't need to bring bread because he'll give it to us? Is it just that they're stupid and they just can't plan ahead? But I wonder about that. Why?
Bread.
What's that?
How long did they think the trip was going to take?
Good question.
It does say that immediately he got into the boat with his disciples in 10. It could be they just left so fast they forgot to pack.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know how long that trip does take to cross the Sea of Galilee?
It's not very big. I mean,
Yeah, I don't think it's a very big sea.
no, it's not at all. It's really a lake. It's Lake Tiberias. It gets called the Sea of Galilee, but it's really a lake. And a trip these days across the Sea of Galilee in a small boat takes a couple of hours. So maybe it took longer then, but still, we're not talking days. We're not talking 3 days.
Yeah. So what's the big deal about bread?
I think there was the disciples' misunderstanding because they'd just been handling whole baskets full of bread. And yeah, geez, we could at least brought one of the baskets. But
Yeah, there were
but
seven.
Jesus is, I see Jesus sitting there, mulling over the stupid Pharisees and, kind of grinding his teeth over it. And he said, watch out for these people.
Mhm.
And they completely misinterpret his statement. And now, as I say, he's getting testy.
Who wants a nosh?
Yeah. My study Bible says yeast is a symbol of pervasive corruption hidden within human beings, citing Corinthians and Galatians. So there is that
So
reference.
yeast isn't a good thing.
Well, think too about the central feast festival of Judaism, and that is Passover. Think about, you know, if you think about the Passover story, you can think about them leaving Egypt, and the story goes that they didn't have time to let the bread rise, right? So that's why unleavened bread is eaten. So there's something going on. He's definitely playing with something with the yeast here.
Well, at
You
that
know,
time, of course, people didn't know what yeast actually was. I mean, you didn't get a little packet of Fleischmann's.
Exactly.
You had probably, it was a sourdough that a sponge that you just put a piece of into your dough, and it would somehow miraculously make the bread fat. So I can see it, John, as being seen as a mysterious thing that can pervade a whole batch of bread.
On the sourdough note, I mean, somebody who uses sourdough extensively, it can go bad. And when it smells rotten, it is rotten.
Good point.
But then take that forward to the Easter Vigil service, and I think there's a phrase in there about the leaven of malice, not with the leaven of malice, but the leaven of righteousness. So there are different kinds of leaven in our understanding historically.
Old leaven as opposed to the new leaven. Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
And that's also
that's very true in brewing. If your yeast goes bad, the whole batch just dump it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Spoken as two brewers there, one to another. Anything else that strikes you in that section?
It seems as though the numbers have to have some meaning to them, and he again berates them for not understanding. So I think that one of the symbolisms of the 12 and the 7 have to be important.
I agree. And I also think that the 3 days is not random. Again, Mark, doesn't throw in extraneous details. So for him to say that Jesus says they've been with me 3 days, like, okay, neon sign, what happens after 3 days? And obviously, the gospel is written after the crucifixion and resurrection. So this is retrojected back into the story. But, I think that that's got to be at least a foreshadowing, right? Little signpost along the way. Pay attention. And then of course the Pharisees, what did they do? They ask for a sign. So Jesus is giving signs, and if the healings that he did were meant to demonstrate the power of God and the inbreaking of the kingdom of God, there are signs that are happening, but not on demand the way the Pharisees are asking for.
Haven't you been paying attention?
Yeah.
You're as bad as the disciples.
If you have eyes to see and ears to hear, you wouldn't ask for that because I'm all around you.
Yeah, the sign is in front of you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so it makes me wonder, how do we make Jesus groan? And how do we make Jesus go, oi, when God is working all around us and we don't perceive or understand? We miss the signs in front of us, even though they seem pretty obvious. I'm sure to Jesus they seem very obvious, but maybe less so to us.
Are your hearts hard?
Yeah, exactly. And we keep hearing, that keeps coming up in Mark, right? And, always casting back to Pharaoh. And so it's interesting, again, in the context of talking about leaven, that Jesus brings up the hardening of the hearts. Are you like Pharaoh? That would be the immediate implication. Well, good stuff, friends. Anything else before we quit? If not, we'll pick up next week with the blind man at Bethsaida, which is a great story.
That's the other hard job.
Yeah, exactly. The two-parter. And now we're moving into, moving toward a real turning point in Mark's gospel, as next week we go to Caesarea Philippi, and the story that we heard recently on a Sunday of Jesus asking, who do people say that I am? And then who do you say that I am? So stay tuned, and we'll talk about that next time. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Patty.
Thank everybody.
Bye.
Patty.
Bye-bye.
Everybody.